March 2025. If you know your history, you'll know that on this day, some rather fateful events happened throughout the years. And one of those things may or may not be happening this year. Hopefully it won't. Not likely to happen today, but I'll get into why people think that it might. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday, and relatively soon. So, for some time now, Egypt has been building up a military presence next to the border with Gaza in the Sinai Peninsula. Technically, this is a violation of the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, because that area is supposed to be demilitarized by Egypt under the peace agreement signed at Camp David in 1979, and signed at the White House with Begin and Sadat and President Jimmy Carter at the time. Technically, Egypt is in violation of the peace agreement. And you can say, well, they're doing it just as a show of force to rattle their sabers and show that they're being friendly with the people in Gaza symbolically, even though, of course, in practicality, they're not at all friendly with them, because if they were, they would open their borders to them and let them come in. But they don't open their borders and let them come in. Egyptians who go, Gazans, yeah, Egyptians really, people who live in Gaza, most of whom originate from Egypt, right? That's why many of them have the last name Al-Masri, which means the Egyptian. And you can tell me, well, that's not how family names work in Arabic. Actually, it is. Yes, they have other connective roots with their names. And no, not everyone whose name is Al-Masri is necessarily from Egypt. They may have married into a family with that name, etc. But still, a lot of Al-Masri people in Gaza, and there are a lot of them, are from Egypt. And they would have proudly told you that before 1967 or even 1970. Ever since then, they pretended otherwise. Suddenly they would, oh, no, we're not from Egypt, we're from Gaza, we're from Palestine. Before that, they would never have said they're from Palestine because they rejected the very notion of a Palestine state. There are countless numbers of Palestinian tribal leaders and people, leaders among the Palestinian people, leading voices, I should say, who said very clearly, we are not Palestinians. Palestinians are only an invented concept. And many times, and many of them said, you know, the Jews invented the name Palestinians. No, the Jews did not invent the name Palestinians. It was a name invented long ago, first by the Greeks, and Philistine, and the Philistine people. Philistina was invented by the Greeks after the Philistine people. The Romans later used Syria, Palestina, which again, they created that name, Palestina, for the purpose of offending Jews, insulting Jews, basically rubbing salt in the wound after they had conquered the land and kicked out most of the Jews and captured many of them and taken them into slavery in Rome and scattered them throughout the empire. So the name Palestine literally is a derivation of a word intended to offend and insult Jews who they had beaten in battle. That's where the name comes from. Throughout the centuries, the name was used and turned to Palestine, eventually in English, and remained as such. And it was never a country. There were no king or president or prime minister of Palestine. And if you tell me, well, the Egyptians created a government in Gaza called the All Palestine Government, it was a protectorate of Egypt. And if you tell me, well, no, it was technically sovereign. No, it was not sovereign. If it was sovereign, where's their currency? What was their language? Where was their identity? Why is it that they fled to Cairo within months of the 1948-1949 Israeli War of Independence breaking out when the Arabs attacked Israel? Why did they go to Cairo? Why did they not stand and fight in their own country? Well, you're going to tell me, oh, because, well, de Gaulle ran to England. Yeah, de Gaulle ran to England because his government had been overthrown. They did not have a government in Gaza. They had 12 so-called government departments run by Egypt. They were not sovereign. No one elected a leader. They were appointed by the king of Egypt at the time. You want to go back, I'll go back. But let's go back to the point of the video before I wrap this up. In Gaza, right now, there are 2.2 million Gazans. More, in fact, than there were at the beginning of the war that started on October 7th, 2023, which is now coming up on a year and a half. It's been more than 17 months now. Why are the Egyptian forces lining up on the Gaza border? If they're not there to show a bravado, fake sense of kinship with their kin, their genetic kin, their historical kin that live in Gaza, what are they doing there? Why do they have so many tanks and hand gliders and paratroopers, God knows what else, lined up on the border with Gaza? Are they going to attack Gaza? No. They're there to possibly to tell Israel we might go into Gaza and quote unquote defend it. And also we might attack you if you don't stop attacking the poor Gazans. Again, Egypt is in violation of the peace treaty. Technically speaking, Israel right now could just lay waste to those forces in the act of self-defense. Why doesn't Israel do that? Well, Israel doesn't do that because Israel realizes, because they're at the ready, that Egypt doesn't have a kinetic chance in hell, despite having massive numbers advantage. The Egyptian Air Force, despite being very well equipped by the United States, and their best trainers are their American trainers, the average Egyptian pilot is not combat ready like the average Israeli pilot. It's not even close. The average Egyptian soldier, in fact, no Egyptian soldier has really ever been in a war. The last time they were in a war was in the Yom Kippur War. Now, have their special forces done things in the past 50 years? Yes. Did they get rid of ISIS when ISIS was taking over parts of Gaza? Yes, they did. But they got rid of ISIS with the help of Israel. They got rid of those bad guys with the help of Israel. Could they have done it alone? Maybe. But it helped them that they had Israel's help. Israel and Egypt have historically been helpful to each other since the peace treaty. And there's no reason to believe that Israel and Egypt will not continue to be helpful to each other, even as this crisis continues to bubble up. Right now, Gaza, which is technically having a ceasefire extended, not officially, but unofficially, is in a kind of wait and see pattern. Stephen Witkoff, the American envoy of the United States government, is waiting to see what happens this week as talks begin again in Qatar between Hamas and Israel, and mediated by Qatar and Egypt and the United States, which also has recently said that it holds direct talks now with Gaza, with Hamas. The policy that used to be basically not the way the Americans conducted business. In theory, Americans had a policy since more than 45 years, since Ronald Reagan came to office, of quote-unquote not negotiating with terrorists. But that policy is full of it. The policy is not real. The United States does, in fact, and has for a long time, negotiated with terrorists. But openly now, they're negotiating with terrorists. And you can question whether or not that's wisdom or folly, but you can no longer question whether or not they're doing it. Because as a matter of fact, they are. And you can also keep in mind that Egypt has very little money in terms of outside of the money the U.S. gives them in foreign aid. It's not like Israel, which doesn't really need the money at all that the U.S. gives it, and that successive prime ministers have actually asked the United States to reduce or even stop the money that it gives to Israel. People don't understand that. The foreign aid the U.S. gives to the United States, to Israel, the United States gives to Israel, is not really aid. It's credit on a shopping list for Israel to buy from the United States products, military products. That credit is used, unfortunately, as military and political pressure by the United States in many ways to continue the conflict longer than it needs to go. Right? It is, in fact, a way for the conflict to never end. Not because of Israel, but because the United States wants the conflict to continue. What? I thought the United States was Israel's ally. Yeah, the United States is Israel's ally. But the United States is also the organization, the entity, that is the leading entity, along with Russia, but mainly the United States now, that causes this conflict to continue. Now, I say that knowing full well that the United States has a quote-unquote ally in the White House and has many allies in Congress. But their military-industrial complex wants the conflict to continue. If you don't believe that, well, then I have a beach to sell you in South Dakota. Now, of course, Iran is far more responsible in terms of kinetic causes for the attacks. Iran is the group that actually pays the terrorists directly to continue attacking Israel. So it's not like it's all the U.S.'s fault. It's not all the U.S.'s fault, clearly. But the U.S. is largely to blame for the continuation of the conflict, just as is Iran, because they both want the conflict to continue. Because it lets both of them have a forward-going plan to be involved in the Middle East and to dictate to Israel and to other countries in the region what they should or should not be doing. That's called having political influence. And without the conflict going on, they don't have as much influence. If there was peace and prosperity in Israel, and if Israel lived in peace and prosperity side by side with its Arab neighbors, all of them, there would be no overwhelming American political influence in Israel. And I gotta go, guys. I'll talk to you later. Bye.